Let's start from 2010.
Yes.
Okay. And give people a picture of 13 years ago. What was going on for you at that time?
So at that time, I was living in York, Maine, which my friends had asked if I had internet. Yes, York, Maine does have internet.
That's so rude.
So rude. And I unfortunately was living with somebody who I thought was like the love of my life. And unfortunately, he was suffering from narcissism, sex addiction, love addiction, codependency, alcoholism, overspending. It was,
Holy
I
smokes.
had no idea.
He had it all.
He had it all. And I didn't know to call any of those things by name, maybe except for alcoholism, because I had grown up with alcoholism. But at that time, I had been living with him for about a year. We were talking about taking the next steps in our relationship, and it got physically abusive one night. And I just found myself, and on both ends.
Yeah.
And I just found myself saying to him, you choose the bar over me. And in that moment, I realized that was the exact same line that I've actually said to my mom when I was growing up. And that moment was the kind of catalyst when they say like shit hits the fan, or that's what it was for me, is like it actually trajected me into therapy. Ultimately, I landed in 12-step recovery myself, which we can go into, and then ended up like having a profession over this. So what's interesting is I'm very thankful that all happened, but I got to tell you, at the time, wasn't so thankful.
Well, no,
Wasn't
of
so
course
thankful.
not.
No.
Of course not.
The emotional abuse, the physical, it was mostly emotional though.
Wow.
Mostly like the breaking you apart, like the love bombing, like making you feel like you are so incredible and you're the best thing since a hot shower, and then all of a sudden you're nothing.
Mm-hmm.
I would have said sliced bread, but I just feel like a hot shower is a lot better than sliced bread.
I mean, honestly, yeah, same.
So I literally just said that to somebody in the car, and I was like, "That's a weird analogy."
Honestly, I didn't even question it.
I know. I just saw you
It made
smirk.
sense. I didn't think twice.
I just found myself in this place where I was like, okay, what the Lifetime special movie just happened? I got $10.47 in my name. I can't even pay for a motel down the street because the motel's $47. I had to borrow money from my uncle. And I was doing the back and forth of like, I left him for a little while. I got back together with him, and I was secretive about getting back together with him. And, if anybody's out there in a narcissistic relationship or has been in one, that there's really high highs and really low lows. Mm-hmm. And so the highs actually make up for the lows because they're so good, whether it's really passionate sex or whether it is great conversation or just how easily it is to laugh with one another. So what I found was when it got to be that really low, there were enough lows that were happening one after another. And when it became physical abuse, that's when I realized like I could recognize like, oh shit, this is gonna get worse before it gets better. And ultimately ended up asking for help. And I called my dad, who lives near you, and he said, there's this woman that she's been in our life for a really long time. She's had similar experience of, not only growing up with alcoholism, but also being in a relationship with somebody who has it. I think you should call her. So like logically I didn't.
Of course not.
That makes sense, right? Yeah.
Right.
Like logically I was like, I don't need her help.
We often do that.
Truth be told, I was just ashamed. I was embarrassed. I was like, how did I get here? I'm like college educated, have two parents in my life, like have a good upbringing, or so I thought. Right. And then started recognizing that like I actually am somebody who prides herself on being so fiercely independent. That was then. So fiercely independent. I don't need help. I don't need to ask for help. And that ended up really kicking my butt because I lost my job at that time because I was so inconsistent with my performance. And I didn't realize at the time I was having PTSD symptoms, which are hypervigilance, not sleeping, overeating, undereating, being lethargic, things like that. And so it wasn't until I found out that that it became a physical abuse. He had cheated once before and was getting into a relationship with another woman all but 2 days later.
Holy smokes.
That for me was like the icing on the cake. And I ended up calling this woman who has been a coach and mentor to me now for, that whole time. And she really changed the course of my life. I say that in the way that she showed up for me when she said she would. If she couldn't, she let me know. She didn't judge, shame, or criticize me, and she kept what we said between the two of us. And that for me was built trust. And that's what she said. Like, my job is to do two things. One is to build trust with you, and that means you have to do it with me too.
Right.
And then also, I'm going to teach you how to love you. And I was like, yeah. I keep hearing this from like my grandmother and family. Like, I need to love myself before anybody else will love me. Like, it's such a bullshit line. And she was like, but do you love yourself? And I was like,
The verdict's still out.
verdict's still out at that time.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to pause you there for a second because there's already so much to unpack. I just want to commend you and say thank you for being so vulnerable. It is not that easy. And I'm sure for you now, it's like muscle memory, but to get to a place where you can first start talking about it and then be able to actually talk about it in a public setting and as on a platform and, you know, as a way to help others, that takes a tremendous amount of courage. So thank you for that. And I really appreciate you being here and being so open. Were you always this way? Well, I guess not, because you didn't want to go to that next step to have that conversation with her and sort of get and seek help. You weren't always the type of like, I'm an open book, vulnerable, like no problem.
It's funny you say that. I was an open book with people to try to build a false sense of intimacy. So one of the characteristics of growing up with alcoholism is you often chameleon yourself. So, you know, if you're sitting like that, then I'll sit like that. Or if you're talking in an accent, I'll talk like an accent. I know it's silly, but actually pay attention to it. There are people in your life who do this, and it's really interesting when you start to see it. So that's what I exhibited. And so what I found was when I was getting to know somebody, in order to make them feel more comfortable, like they could trust me, when really, subconsciously, I wanted to be able to trust them, I would overshare. I would overshare in order for them to create this bond with them. Mm-hmm. And what I realized is that I was sharing with the wrong people.
Yeah, or you share like less pertinent information, right? Like the things that are really, really super personal to us, maybe you don't disclose, but you can tell, you know, what you had for breakfast, last time I went to the bathroom, like all these like random little things that like really don't matter, but it's just a way of trying to connect.
Yeah, I think sometimes people I'll do that now. Like you almost test the waters. But I think what I used to do, if we're talking about like who I was back then, oh no, girl, I would give it all and just see how they would react. And oftentimes what would happen is I'd be telling the wrong person. So there would be shame, there would be judgment, there would be gossip or criticism, and they would tell somebody else, for example. And so that would recreate the story of worthiness for me. Like, I'm not good enough. See, I do these things, and then these people act this way. Mm-hmm. Well, really, I wasn't testing the waters by giving little bits of information to see how they handled those. Could they be sensitive, empathetic, compassionate? Could they keep what we say between us? Mm-hmm. And that's a big lesson that I've learned now.
Absolutely. Also, how kind of ironic that your story had to come full circle before something finally clicked. You never, you know, it takes a really long time for people to start making those comparisons, and oftentimes it's a third party that like that outsider looking in to be like, well, don't you see why you're acting like this with your boyfriend because of your relationship with your mother? Like you actually came to that conclusion on your own. But how interesting that we sort of have a tendency to repeat those patterns without even knowing or without even intending or meaning to.
It wasn't until I met this person that my dad introduced me to, who then became a mentor all these years later, is that I recognized that, oh my gosh, this is actually like 100% common, that people who have grown up with some sort of dysfunction, by the way, we all have.
Yes.
Right? We all have. We just don't know necessarily to call it by name. Mm-hmm. But once I started to recognize like, oh, that's dysfunction, or that's a characteristic of it, or then it made sense for me.
Yeah.